it must have been difficult when you just have to, no one understands you. You're away from home, and you don't associate directly with the experiences of anyone else. I can imagine how difficult that might be, and how much that helped grow resilience in some way, as your previous experience did as well.
Yeah, 100%. And what I will say is, I had an amazing time and I met the most amazing people. It's two of the best 2.5 years of my life that I look fondly on. It was really just the early stages that I found a little bit weird. And then I just kind of went all in and I just said, okay, if I'm going to be here away from my family, I'm going to say hello to every person I meet. I'm going to make the effort. I'm going to go and shake people's hands and I introduce myself, and I'm going to make the most of this, because that was why I was there. I was not necessarily there to learn about Google Ads or whatever it was I was going to learn. It was like, oh, these are some of the smartest kids from Europe. Let me just go and make this amazing network. And yeah, so eventually I think I realized that I got so used to being flexible. It's something I've actually had to work on consciously now, is to be less flexible almost, because sometimes you can almost like lose who you are when you're always adapting to the other person or the person that you're with. It helps in some ways because you have empathy for that person. You can try to put yourself in their boots. And in sales, it helps a lot, right? But for just being a happy person, it's a different story. I think you need to have a good sense of yourself too.
What advice would you give to someone who's in a difficult situation, like feeling isolated, feeling as if they're the only one in that type of situation? You've been through multiple times like that. What advice would you say to that person?
Yeah, I mean, I would just offer like things that worked for me, and like and maybe that could be helpful for someone. I would say things that helped me were getting out of that comfort zone, and that sounds like everyone agrees with that on a high level, but to be more specific with examples, by the time we fast forward like 5 years or so, I ended up in New York, where I'm now based, and I had another low at that moment. So we might go into some of that later, but that was probably the lowest point I've had, where I was like, on the outside it looked like I had everything to my friends and my parents and everything, more than I ever imagined, but on the inside I was like deeply, basically depressed. And what I did at that moment was really to get outside of my comfort zone by doing things that I don't usually do. So in my case, I started writing, and that sounds like, okay, cool, let's just go and write a journal or something. But I just started writing, and I ended up writing stuff that was completely random that I didn't even know I had in me. And it ended up becoming this, like, have you seen the Moth or like spoken word?
Yeah.
So I basically started doing that style of stuff. And what I liked about that was, because I'd always liked that, because I'm like a hip hop fan. So I always loved like real lyricists, and that's probably where it came from. But I just started writing stuff about like experiences and identity and telling stories and stuff like that. And that's completely different to my day-to-day work, right? Like, I was going to work looking at numbers all day, speaking to like brands. And then at home, I'd come home and I'm writing and stuff like that. And then eventually I started going and performing those and sharing those in front of strangers at open mics. And at the peak, I was basically doing that every day. And I would go on my own. And that's one of my favorite things about New York, is you can just like, there's a feeling of being anonymous almost. Like, you can just go and reinvent yourself in a night, and that's kind of a cool thing. Whereas when you're a kid, you're at school and you're with the same friends, and if you've got bullies at school, you're seeing them every day. This is just like, okay, I'm going to take a step out of my regular life, and I'm just going to go and hang out with new people, meet strangers, and have a new experience. So that really helped me, because if you can go on a stage and like share basically your soul with strangers for a few hours, the next day, like, everything is easy, so that's kind of one of the things that really helped me.
What got you to make that decision of, oh, I'm going to share this? Was that a difficult decision for you?
Yeah, well, it was weird because I didn't actually plan to share it. I was really just writing for myself. And to be honest, I was almost kind of embarrassed, because it's not, like, if you know me, that's not really something you'd think, like, oh, Bilal writes about identity and his childhood in Pakistan. Like, that's so random. I guess people who know me closer, more deeply, would probably think, oh, he probably would do something random like that. But I think the sharing part actually came from, I went home for Christmas to see my family, and I was sitting there. I remember actually, because it was quite like kind of a moment that really changed me. I was sitting with my dad, who I'm really close with, but I feel like we have this relationship where, I speak to him almost every day. But, if you're speaking every day, there's not much new stuff to update you on, right? So to have those deeper conversations is difficult. And we were just there, he was watching TV, and I just had this weird thing. We were talking about what's going on in Pakistan because he was watching the news, and I was like, oh, I remember I wrote this thing about Lahore, which is where he's originally from. I was like, oh, Dad, by the way, I was writing this thing, like, let me just share it with you. And I was almost kind of like embarrassed to share it, and he was watching TV, so he was kind of not really paying attention. And then as I started like reading it to him, he just put his glasses down. He was like, oh wow, this is really good, like start again. And then I tell him the whole thing, and I'm like, oh, he's like genuinely liking it. Where there's a difference between parents just saying, oh, that's good work, pat on the head. No, this was like he genuinely liked it. And then he called my whole family in the room, and my brother came in, and my sister, and my mum, and they were like, can you read this out? And I was like kind of embarrassed again, but I was like, okay, cool, it's my family, whatever. And what happened was I read it out, and my brother, who is the most like honest, to the point sort of guy, he was like, oh wow, Bilal, this is really good. And that just lifted my mood. Wow. And when he said that, and I don't want to go into all the details, but like he's had some like problems with his own, like being depressed and stuff too. So when he said that, I was like, oh wow, I can lift the mood of my brother or someone like that through my words. And that's something you can't put a price on. And that was the first time I was like, wow, the power of words in this way. It's similar to like the moment in the classroom. It just kind of clicks. So by the time I came back to New York in January, I said, okay, maybe I can do this with other people, and maybe they'll gain from it too. And I'd been going to this place called Nuyorican Poets Cafe in East Village, because it's one of my favorite places in New York. And I'd seen people perform, and I was just like, it looked like a different world. And then one time I just like forced myself to write my name down, and I did it, and it was game changer. It's like the feeling I have doing that is, I can't compare it to anything else.
What do you think you gain from sharing your own story? What do you think it is inside of you? Because I think this is such a common theme from people who share their story and it helps someone else. What do you think in it that helps you when you share your own story?
I guess it's kind of like therapy in one way. It's part therapy, it's part art, So I'm a numbers driven business person on one side, and then I'm like this deep creative on another side, where I really love the details of like putting something together. And that feeling of, I'm sure you feel this with your podcast and writing that you do and stuff, but like just that feeling of like one person gained from it is just such an amazing feeling. And yeah, there's a part of it, if I'm being like objective about it, it's probably a part of you that likes being on stage too, right? Like that's a part of it. So I call it the look at me gene. I took that from a famous interviewer in the UK uses that phrase. And that sounds like a selfish, like, oh, look at me, I want attention. And there's probably a part of that, don't get me wrong. But it's the sort of thing that allows people to even get to that stage. It allows you to do this podcast, or someone to go and sing in front of a crowd. So it can be a negative thing if you allow it to get to that stage, but if you use it in a positive way, it can push you to higher levels, I think.